Hi guys, and welcome to my tutorial on drugs and alcohol. Today I'll be talking obviously about drugs and alcohol and the ways that it actually affects our Indigenous community here in Australia. First, a quick introduction. My name's Zach Sneddon. I'm a fourth year, so hopefully after I finish all these presentations, I'll be graduating. So hopefully you guys enjoy. Just a quick introduction to drugs and alcohol. So the use of tobacco and alcohol places a great burden on the Australian healthcare system. So as a PDHPE teacher, I actually teach a lot about our healthcare system, and I know the impacts that tobacco and alcohol have on all our private hospitals, public hospitals, and the taxpayers' dollar. So the National Drug Strategy Household Survey found that 15% of Australians aged 14 years and older had used illicit substances in the previous 12 months, which is pretty shocking to me, especially considering that we're teaching students that are obviously aged from 12 to 18, so it was pretty shocking. And around 42% had used an illicit substance at least once in their lifetime. So that's nearly half of our population, which is crazy. Illicit drug use contributes significantly to ill health in Australia. It is associated with injury, violence, chronic disease, blood-borne viruses, and lower levels of social and emotional well-being. In 2011 to 2012, there were over 46,000 hospital separations with a principal diagnosis related to illicit drug use, representing about 43% of all hospital separations related to drug use during this time period, which for me personally, I think that number's way too high. So now I'll be just looking into Indigenous Australians and problems with illicit drugs and alcohol. So firstly, I'll just talk about illicit drugs. So illicit drug use amongst Indigenous Australians is socially determined and are both a consequence and cause of a social and economic disadvantage. So what this means is Indigenous Australians' social status and their economic disadvantage actually are in complete relation with drug use, okay? Socially determined means their social status. So what that means is where they are in their social group and where they belong in society. So drug use is associated with measures of social disadvantage and is the strongest for the illicit drugs versus the licit, and also for more intensely problematic patterns of drug use, including dependence. So this means that people that take the drugs, illicit drugs especially, become dependent on drugs in their life. So that means that they have to take them roughly every 24 to 48 hours. If we just have a look at that little graph there that I've actually got off our website that I was accessing. So you have a look at Indigenous Australians are grey, and then the general Australian population is a lighter grey. So you look at illicit drug use. So 28.2% of Indigenous Australians compared to 13.4%. So talking about cannabis, which is probably one of the most popular drugs in Australia at the present time, it's 22.6% compared to 9.1%, which is a huge difference. So amphetamines, so 5.9% to 2.5%, which is not a massive jump compared to cannabis. And then we've got ecstasy at the end, which is pretty close because that's more of a party drug type thing, which is often associated with white culture. Today I'll be more focusing on petrol sniffing and alcohol because there's a lot of information based around petrol sniffing and also alcohol problems in the Indigenous community. So it's quite interesting to actually have a look at the effects that it has on a community and culture, and also just the effects of the individual. So just quickly, petrol sniffing is a serious problem that has claimed over 100 Indigenous Australian lives from 1981 to 2003 across Australia. So that was the most recent statistic that I could actually find on petrol sniffing. Just a quick overview of what it is. It's not a drug people tend to overdose on. So the easiest way to explain petrol sniffing is it actually cooks and melts the brain. Okay, so it destroys all the nerves and neurons in your brain and people become unfunctional. So petrol sniffing produces a variety of short-term effects for pleasurable feelings of excitement to alcohol-like intoxication to loss of consciousness. So it has the same effect on the body as what alcohol has, and that's mostly the feeling that people are going for. The effects are experienced within a few minutes and only last for a short time, which is the main reason for its use, usually less than an hour. So unlike alcohol, when somebody engages in petrol sniffing, it's actually out of their body. The effects and the high gone within the hour. Whereas someone's intoxicated, they can stay intoxicated up to 6 to 12 hours. Okay, so we'll just have a quick look at long-term effects, which is something that is pretty scary. So long-term effects can cause so they can damage internal organs, the brain and the nervous system, because petrol is a solvent. When sniffed, its fumes travel up the nose and dissolve fatty tissue in the brain. As I mentioned earlier, the easiest way to explain it is that it melts the brain away. Some damage can be reserved by ceasing use of certain substances, but permanent damage can occur to the brain, liver, and kidneys. The person becomes degraded, disabled, or dies. And obviously, death is something that's probably less common. What actually is more common is people become disabled, so they can't actually use their limbs, which is fairly scary. So in our marking criteria, it actually states that we need to have an activity. So if we were to teach this in a class, so for example, I'd get you guys to form groups of 3 or 4 to create a small 5-minute presentation / PowerPoint highlighting either the effects of petrol sniffing or prevention methods that are in place to overcome the issue. Okay, so what that would require you guys to do is looking at so we'll go into it a bit later in my presentation, but there's a fuel called opal fuel, which is created by BP, so British Petroleum, which actually has certain fumes and chemicals taken out of it to take away that high. So we'll go into that a bit later. Introduction of non-sniffable fuel. So this is what I was talking about, opal fuel. So in an effort to reduce the epidemic of petrol sniffing in Indigenous communities, BP, or what's British Petroleum, as what's known as BP, introduced a new petrol brand called Opal in the early 2005s. This is the first time a product has been specifically designed to assist remote communities, and in particular Indigenous communities, to fight petrol sniffing. Opal fuel is subsidised by the federal government to sell at the same price, costing about 4 million Australian dollars a year. This has been highlighted in a done in Catherine, so an Indigenous 5.5% high Indigenous community population, and what he was saying was that it only takes one petrol outlet to actually break down contract talks for Opal, and that would actually collapse the whole deal in the Northern Territory and far north Queensland when it's talking about non-sniffable fuel. Because if there's one source of petrol, a petrol station that has sniffable fuel, which is just like your unleaded or your E10, then obviously everything would just collapse. So throughout Australia, the introduction of non-sniffable opal fuel helps the Indigenous community reduce petrol sniffing rates and helps improve overall health. A report published in 2004 also found that the number of petrol sniffers plummeted for about 80%, from 546 in 2005 to 7 to roughly about 97 in 2011-12. So that's a big change just since the introduction of the opal fuel. You could already see that the numbers are dropping. So 15 sample Aboriginal communities, petrol sniffing numbers obviously plummeted. So this is from the tracker, which is done in the 14th of the 1st, 2014. So guys, this is just a little table that I found, and obviously my source is up the top here. So this is just to give you guys a rough understanding of why opal fuel is different to other fuels, okay? So if we have a look at the top, it says properties. So it goes opal, Ava gas, unleaded. So the color of opal fuel is actually yellow, which you look at your unleaded fuel, it is kind of like a purple or a bronze. Aromatics, which is actually the smell and the fumes that get people high, is 5%. So only 5% of the fuel, which you compare it to the other two, is at least a quarter. So you look at Ave gas, which is 20%, unleaded is 48%. Okay, benzene's 1%, where Ave gas is above 3.5% and unleaded is above 5%. Lead, you can have a look at those numbers, guys. Like compared to Ave gas, it's a lot lower, but you have a look at unleaded and it's about roughly the same. Sulfur, so 150 compared to 500 and above 500. And you can see down the bottom where it says sniffable, no, yes, and yes. So guys, this is just to give you a rough understanding about actually what is happening with this non-sniffable fuel. Okay. So the second part of my presentation will focus on alcohol abuse, because this is something that Brad's obviously highlighted throughout our lectures. So Indigenous Australians and alcohol abuse. Indigenous Australians' behaviour with alcohol changed significantly once white Australians invaded. Okay, so what that means is before 1788, Indigenous Australians had no issue with alcohol due to the fact that this is mostly a white European product. Okay, within a couple of months of the arrival of the first fleet, many pubs opened. Okay, so everyone in Australia knows what a pub is now, because it's very much embedded in our culture. Many Indigenous Australians had their wages stolen and were paid in alcohol or tobacco. So this is the main cause of the problem. So many white Australians employed Indigenous Australians for labour and for their workforce, but instead of paying them wages, they actually pay them in alcohol or tobacco. So this is things like cigarettes, beer, spirits, that type of thing. So the current policy for targeting alcohol misuse in Australia, the National Alcohol Strategy 2006-09, aims to prevent and minimise alcohol-related harm to individuals, families and communities in the context of developing safer and healthy drinking cultures in Australia. So many people know that Australia has a poor drinking culture. Okay, so our culture relies heavily around alcohol and that kind of thing. So the second part of my presentation is what's being done about alcohol and how are we as a community helping our Indigenous Australians, and also at a government level. So primary prevention is something into in PDHB. Interventions also include, for example, school and parent education programs. So that's what I was highlighting earlier in my presentation. As a PE teacher, we have a responsibility to educate our students about alcohol, tobacco, and drug use. So this is something that's actually implied at a federal level. So between the years 7 to 10, it's a legislation that all students have to sit PDHPE, which I think is very understandable. And activities that provide alternatives to alcohol use. So this is things just such as informing our students that you don't need to have alcohol to have a good time, and give them reasons to stay away from alcohol for as long as possible. Another strategy for reducing alcohol use is to limit the supply of alcohol. Okay, so this is a tough one because, as I said, Australia's got a very heavy drinking culture, and a lot of our income and a lot of our jobs rely around people actually consuming alcohol. These include alcohol content beverages such as cask wine. So cask wine's just like, for example, is a very cheap alternative for people to get intoxicated. So as it says there, it's low cost. So it's roughly about $10 for 8 litres, 7 litres, but it's high alcohol. Okay, so that encourages people to get intoxicated at a lower price. Restrictions on hours of trading. So under New South Wales law, after 10:30, no alcohol should be sold as takeaways. So that means for pubs and clubs, people that purchase alcohol at their venue won't be able to walk out the door with it. And also for bottle shops, their trading hours are limited until 10:30 p.m. And bans of consumption of alcohol, and that's meant to say in public places. So that means drinking in public. So there's stricter laws now, and I know in America that they actually have very strict laws when it comes to drinking in public. Guys, that's just a few sources, but most of my sources are actually on my worksheet. So thank you for listening.